I once found myself at the base of a minor Erd tree, a child of the tree in the center of the world that glows so brightly that it's sometimes difficult to tell day from night. It's a sapling compared to the real Erd tree, but it's still big enough to place you in a constant state of paranoia. Walk slow, sword drawn, there is almost certainly something on the other side. Elden Ring is a game that likes to encourage this kind of paranoia, fixating all your senses on the next threat, which is why, in that moment, at the base of a minor Erd tree, I was not prepared for what happened next. Like in most good video games, time tends to lose its meaning in Elden Ring. I'm not sure how long I looked for the singer, but I wouldn't be surprised to hear it was half an hour or so. I looked around the tree, I looked for caves, I looked across the sea and wondered if someone's voice could carry that far. I looked with the expectation that whatever I found would be important, that whoever was singing would be crucial to my character's narrative, which is to say I thought I had to find her because whatever the reason for her singing, it probably had to do with me. Finally, I ran along the edge of a cliff until I saw a lower level I had missed. That's where I found the singer. This is not a lore video, by which I mean that you are not likely to learn much about the immense plot of this game from what I say here. To be completely honest, I am, myself, much less interested in the lore of Elden Ring than I am about the ways the lore is spun as you play it. In Elden Ring, you, the player, are placed in the uncomfortable and narratively unusual position of knowing less than your own character. You're something called a tarnished, you need a maiden for some reason, your order or race or creed or whatever it is you actually are is under the direction of two fingers who convey the instructions of a god called the Greater Will, and who are actually a pair of giant fingers you can actually visit. The Elden Ring in question is an artifact that, in short, held the world together before it was broken by the goddess who was supposed to keep it safe. Your job is to put it back together again. I am a very slow video game player. I like to explore every inch of an open world, and after completing about 3% of the game over the course of several real-world days, what slowly became apparent to me was not only how little the lore actually seemed to matter, but how often the game seems to go out of its way to deny you access to the lore it so painstakingly brought to life. There's no quest log, no journal, very little NPC assistance, and most importantly for my purposes, no bestiary. Many video games will give you an automatic informational update of some kind anytime you meet a new enemy. At the very least, you learn its name or how it attacks, and in a high fantasy setting like Elden Ring, this would be the intuitive direction to take. Why go to the trouble of designing so many monsters in such detail if we don't even get to know their names? I'm given to understand that this is pretty standard for Bloodborne and the Souls games, but I've never played a From Software game, so this was a surprise to me. How dare they? Tell me what the monsters are called. I want to know what the monsters are called. Fantasy world building is generally approached in two ways, hard and soft. Hard world building is the Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones type, based on internal plausibility and an answer to every question. If there is magic, it comes from somewhere real and knowable, and people can, will, and do devote reams of time to nailing down the precise taxonomies of certain fictional beings or the grammatical structures of languages no one really speaks. That's part of the fun of it, learning the rules for a world, getting to decode the cause and effect. Soft world building is the fairy tale kind of storytelling, where strange and wondrous things happen and you're just gonna have to make peace with the fact that you'll never really know why. They're usually mutually exclusive, these two methods. Trying to combine them typically results in something like Lost, where you're training the audience to expect a concrete answer they're then ultimately denied. In fact, bad horror can often be boiled down to a mismanagement of world-building rules. Horror is metaphorical by nature, and so usually runs on soft world-building logic. Not always, but usually, and if the monster is supernatural, then almost always. A lot of horror starts to fall apart during the investigation part of the movie, which is where the protagonist finds out the real nature of the monster, usually through a lot of non-copyright infringing search engineering, or even better, a trip to the library. Sometimes both. This sucks. because reading is lame. No, it sucks because it externalizes the monster. It turns an object of belief and emotion into an object of study, a reassurance that you'll always ultimately be in control, that you have a safe and orderly world to turn to when your own world becomes impossible to navigate. The Lands Between has rules. It is, in fact, comprised of almost nothing but rules, left over from the many, many ages that have passed before you ever got there. You just aren't really allowed to know what they are. The history of the world you find yourself in is complex beyond what most players have been able to decipher over the past several months since the game's release. There's no shortage of political struggles or ancient institutions to catalog in a ledger, and make no mistake, people do. But whatever the Lands Between looked like before the shattering of the Elden Ring is less important than the idea that the world once was knowable, but is no longer. With the shattering of the ring came the shattering of the logic of the world, a sort of magical post-apocalypse that has warped everything into a stunted forgery of itself, the absence of the greater will's blessings and the actions of previous generations, resulting in a world growing wild and cancerous with feral magic. This is the point at which Elden Ring frequently abandons fantasy and just becomes a pure horror game. No design approach is left in the book here. We get things that are too big, things that are too small, things that are out of any sense of proportion at all, things with too much stuff on them, things with not enough stuff on them, things that are too organic, things that are too mechanical, things that make it clear just how much the natural world wants you dead, things that should be dead but aren't, things that are ferociously beautiful, and things that are so ugly you can't help but laugh. From a safe spot. Video games are great for monster design because counterintuitively, you get to tell more of its story. You have to design your monster with enough thought to account for the fact that it's going to be subject to what amounts to an infinite behavioral experiment. You're going to have millions of people testing what makes your monster work, paying intense attention to what it does and why and how. In film, you can sell an otherwise unconvincing puppet through editing to add tension or dynamism, but that's not a possibility in a game, so you need to choreograph an actual pattern of movement for an imaginary creature. It needs a psychology. You need to make it feel alive. And to that end, knowing more lore doesn't help, any more than knowing someone's name tells you about what their childhood was like, or what kind of friend they are, or whether they mean you harm. Like everything else in the Lands Between, the only immediate information given about these monsters is in the color text attached to some items. Anything else you want to know is only available through context and behavior. And even then, what are we meant to think happened to produce a race of giants with masses of worms where their face should be? Or a disembodied hand with too many fingers. At every turn, there's a feeling of age, creatures clinging so hard to their shreds of tradition that tradition and its empty ritual becomes their entire existence. A reference to some kind of antiquity is not unusual for fantasy, which often operates with varying degrees of nostalgia and callbacks to the glory of the past. But there's a nihilism about the way history is presented here. All the heraldry and grand architecture only serves to reflect how insubstantial and often destructive all these cultures turned out to be. The main ideology in Elden Ring, the one your character ostensibly belongs to and is meant to defend, is called the Golden Order. The Golden Order is the theology of the Greater Will, with the Erd Tree and the Elden Ring being physical manifestations of the Greater Will's blessings. Put simply, the Golden Order worships logic and harmony between all things. Sounds great, right? They're the good guys, right? Wrong! You see, the Golden Order believes that it is the destiny of all things to converge into one. Their goal is not peace, their goal is uniformity. As such, the Golden Order has no tolerance for anything it considers a violation of its own subjectively defined perfect order, and kills anything it considers imperfect. There's already a flaw in this construction of the world, and the admission and effects of this flaw constitutes a significant part of the game. If perfect order is the destiny of all things, then shouldn't any kind of disorder be impossible? If your ideology is perfect and inevitable, why do you have to force it into existence? Given that the Erd Tree functions as a sort of representative of the Greater Will, I think it's interesting how many of the monsters of the Lands Between are constructed using tree imagery, with anatomy that is branched, stunted, blighted, grafted. Despite the Erd Tree's supposed blessings and divinity, so many of the things that live around the Erd Tree reflect all the ways you can violently alter a tree, twist it into something it wouldn't have been otherwise, taking advantage of a plant's brainless ability to take a beating. A grafted tree doesn't know it's been mangled. It's just trying to survive. Elden Ring is a game that shows a strange kind of respect for creatures that acclimate, that know more about certain kinds of survival than you do. And this is on purpose. From Software director Hidetaka Miyazaki explained in an interview, "Most people don't believe me when I say this, but a certain kind of refinement, elegance, and dignity are very important to me. I'll usually tell the designers that flat-out grotesque or splatter-type designs will not get past me. My idea of dignity is something I pursue with every project I work on." One of his artists elaborates, "I remember when I was drawing the undead dragon, I submitted a design draft that depicted a dragon swarming with maggots and other gross things. Miyazaki handed it back to me saying, 'This isn't dignified. Don't rely on the gross factor to portray an undead dragon. Can't you instead try to convey the deep sorrow of a magnificent beast doomed to a slow and possibly endless descent into ruin? Could you do that for me, sweetie?'" So what does this mean? What does it do to your experience of the story to be asked to respect the hideous things that want you dead, so very dead all the time? Elden Ring is thematically a game about ideology. All the cultures you encounter in the game have their own theologies and hierarchies, their own representation of reality that each of them considers all-powerful and beyond failure. The factions in Elden Ring have all, at one time or another, had capital G godlike power over logic, over knowledge, over death itself. But that didn't stop them from being arrogant, petty, intolerant. Many of them had power enough to run the universe, but none of them inherently deserved it. Not even the greater will. Not even you. It's a story that asks an uncomfortable question. Even if we had clear and present evidence for the existence of God, would worship really be the right response? Despite how that sounds, I don't think this is necessarily an argument against religion. Elden Ring is actually pretty optimistic about the possibility of fixing a broken faith. But it is a warning against abandoning yourself to a god without asking what that god might turn you into. We become what we believe. I think this is why encountering the singing harpy affected me as much as it did. Here's a creature physically shaped by the world it lives in and the powers that run that world. The song she's singing is in Latin, and of course somebody immediately translated it. "Oh, that land, formerly blessed, now withered. We had been destined for motherhood, but now have become disfigured. We wailed and wept, but no one comforts us. Golden One, at whom were you so angry?" On some level, she is aware that the monster she turned into isn't what she started as, and isn't what she ever wanted to be. And the way this monster, this grotesque old woman, copes with her existence is through a senseless act of beauty. It solves nothing, it helps nothing, it serves nothing, including you. It just is. It's a reflection of the game's moral ambivalence that though your character, the Tarnished, was brought back to the Lands Between to try and put the Elden Ring back together, actually doing so is optional. One possible ending for Elden Ring involves you choosing to be a vehicle for the frenzied flame, the chaotic opposite of the Golden Order. Your head becomes engulfed in flame and you burn the Erd Tree to the ground, along with the rest of the world you've been exploring for how many tens of hours. The problem, according to this ending, is the imperfection of life itself. Life is the source of all suffering, therefore the best thing for everyone is to end it. Cleanse it all in one big cremation. As a card-carrying depressed person, I have to admit this ending appealed to me for a hot second before I remembered Bach, the demi-human who was so nice and trusting of me, and the kindly tortoise in the Pope hat, and the sheep that tuck their heads and roll away when you get too close. All these gentle things. And I remembered that most of the time when Torrent and I are riding around, things are pretty quiet, and often very beautiful. There are good things too, aren't there? Aren't they worth saving? I think every generation gets a defining horror subgenre. Slashers and home invasion defined the 70s and the 80s, torture porn was the early 2000s. Today's horror is existential. The ideas so many of us were taught and took for granted as recently as a generation ago are no longer quite as impervious as we assumed. It seems fitting then that what a lot of people seem to think of as the definitive game of 2022 is a story of byproducts, things that weren't intended to happen, and the futility of trying to force everything to conform to some all-encompassing and permanent intelligent design, no matter how well intended. People try to do that to each other and it ends in suffering. every time. We try to do it to the planet itself, and it's now coming back at us in forces both awe-striking and devastating. I know Bloodborne and the Souls games aren't exactly flops, but I wonder whether Elden Ring would have been as much of a blockbuster as it was if people weren't as receptive to moral uncertainty and lack of closure as they seem to be right now. And I find that kind of comforting, this reflection of a modern culture shaken off its axis enough for its art to question the nature of authority itself. Because the lesson of Elden Ring is that there is no lesson. While people annihilate themselves and each other over ideas, the world will change in response. It might be beautiful like Liurnia, or cursed and rotten like Caelid, but ultimately whatever it looks like only matters to us. The world itself will keep spinning, and whatever's left on it will just adapt. Whatever ugliness we create is our own responsibility. There is no great cosmic meaning that supersedes the reality of your feet on the ground and breath in your lungs. No incorruptible power that conclusively grants an end to all suffering. The list of concrete realities available to a creature as small and briefly lived as a human is much shorter than we often want to acknowledge. There are trees, there is land, there is rain, there's life and death. And sometimes, if you happen to show up at the right time and place, there is singing. Rita, no. No. Rita, go lie down. Go lie down. Good dog.